Stuart Powell, the national security correspondent for Hearst newspapers.
Stuart Powell, national security correspondent for Hearst newspapers. Are U.S. forces fully prepared to defend Saudi Arabia?
I think there are forces in place now that can start the defense of Saudi Arabia, particularly the aircraft that have been moved into the country over the last 24 hours. But if Saddam Hussein unleashes his forces from the border with Kuwait, starts moving south, we'll need a great deal more force to stop him.
How would you define their mission at this point?
The President yesterday said that the mission was essentially defensive. But General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made it clear to us at the Pentagon that the mission could expand depending on what happens up north on the border with Kuwait.
And just how many troops are we talking about at this point, U.S. troops?
There are about 5,000 forces in country, both ground forces and air crews and aircraft maintenance people. But every indication is that that number could swell by as much as 50,000. And that number could swell much beyond that if the United States gets involved in a land war with Iraqi forces.
So that would be that would trigger it, sending more troops, that sort of thing?
Well, I think if Saddam Hussein moves his forces south from Kuwait, where they are now poised on the border, and starts moving against Saudi Arabia, the United States would be committing far larger numbers of forces to block that.
All the newspapers this morning are talking about the prospect of use of chemical weapons. What type of chemical weapons are we talking about, and how likely is it that they would be used?
Iraq has two types of chemical weapons: nerve gases such as sarin and VX, which interrupt the body's ability to use oxygen, and it has mustard gas, which is a burning agent that suffocates the lungs and causes painful burns. He's used both in the war against Iran, and he's used both against his own people in Kurdish villages. And so it's a real risk. Adolf Hitler had both of these weapons and never used them in the Second World War, and Saddam Hussein has had them and has used them.
The descriptions in the newspapers of the equipment that the troops would use to protect themselves against such nerve gas and others, it describes them as being very heavy and maybe difficult to use in the desert heat. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've been told that the soldiers refer to these as sauna suits. It's kind of a rubberized, quite a heavy garment, fits over the head and over the entire body, and have boots and gloves and everything. And if you operate in that for a couple of hours in that kind of heat, you're going to be completely dehydrated and lose a lot of your capacity to fight or function. But in chemical attacks, the material often dissipates very quickly. So you put this stuff on, you survive the attack, you take it off, and you carry on.
What is known about the Iraqis' equipment for such things? Do they have similar suits and gear?
I don't know the details of what Iraq has to defend, say, against a United States chemical attack, which might come if they were to use them against us. But I would think, judging from the technology that we have generally in contrast to the Third World, that our equipment and defensive measures would be superior.
Good morning again from Washington. We're continuing our discussion about the deployment of U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia. And our guest for the next 45 minutes is Stuart Powell. He's the national security correspondent for Hearst newspapers, and he has been with Hearst for about 3.5 years. Previously, he was a senior editor for special projects at U.S. News and World Report, and he also served as London bureau chief, associate editor, and Middle East correspondent for the News Weekly. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
We'll be going to your phone calls very shortly, and you'll see the numbers on the bottom of your screen. If you're in Eastern or Central time zones, we ask that you use 202-628-2525. And for those of you on the West Coast and in Mountain time zones, we ask that you use 202-783-2727. And we also have a special number set aside for international callers. If you are watching from outside the United States, we ask that you use 202-737-6734. And we will get to your call shortly. We have a map of the region that we will put up right now. If you could just give us a sense of where our troops will be deployed and what their mission is geographically.
Sure.
You see the map on the screen now.
Well, it's not marked on the map, but just to the left of that island, down where it says Persian Gulf, is an air base known as Dhahran, and that's where the United States aircraft are being moved into, and the elements of the 82nd Airborne. it's located very close to the Saudi oil fields, and were Iraq to move into those fields over the next 48 or 72 hours, the U.S. forces would be in the best position to try to block that attack. The second element is there is a command and control element, which is a headquarters element for the United States forces coming into the country, so that if we needed to reinforce that location, the command and control structure, communication systems, headquarters, intelligence, and that sort of thing would already be in place.
What is the likelihood that the U.S. would launch airstrikes against Iraq?
I think under the guidelines that the President has laid down, if Iraq moves its forces south from Kuwait into Saudi Arabia, United States aircraft would try to intercept those movements of troops and tanks. And I think at that point, if they cross into Saudi Arabia, every indication I have is that we would strike back. The real question then becomes, do United States forces move against Iraqi forces in Kuwait and against Iraqi forces in Iraq? And that's a very dicey political judgment, and I think it would have to be made at that time.
Have there been any changes in Iraq's position along the border or in their movements in the last 24 hours?
I've been told at the Pentagon that they've seen no evidence that Saddam Hussein has changed his alert status, has done anything other than keep his forces in place. And at this point, and this is as of late last night, early this morning, there's no indication that he's going to respond to the American deployment at this time. Of course, he has a window of opportunity here, and if were he to strike the oil fields in Saudi Arabia now, our ability to defend those oil fields would be minimal at this point, and would be steadily increased over the next 3 or 4 days.
The window of opportunity being the time it takes our troops to move into the region?
Right.
And when are they supposed to reach their destination?
Some are there now. Apparently 5,000 are there now. There's quite a few American aircraft. The Saudis have a very sophisticated air force, much of it bought from the United States. And so there are forces there now, but there's some indication that within the next month they may have as many as 50,000 American forces there. Ground troops, aircraft crews, aircraft maintenance people, and so on. This is all in addition to the naval force that's moving into the region. And so I think there's substantial force, but if Saddam Hussein seriously wanted to attack Saudi oil fields, he would need to do it in the next 72 hours. Otherwise, there's going to be this flow of American force that I think would be quite an impediment.
Let's go to the phones. Huntington,
Sure.
New York, good morning.
Good morning. I'm 17 now, which means in about a year I'm going to be signing up for the draft. Now this really freaks me out, frankly. What do you feel that there would be a full-scale war from something like this? I'm not talking nuclear. I'm talking, more hand-to-hand and all that.
Well, I think by the time you come up to 18 and see, you'll see the situation at that point. I think a year from now, hopefully things will be stabilized. I think from my point of view, the next 3 or 4 days are the most volatile. Whether Saddam Hussein plans to move into Saudi Arabia, takes a step toward doing that, will be indicated very quickly. If you sign up in a year, I would think, if all works out, we would have forces in Saudi Arabia. They perhaps would be smaller than they are now. We would have a long-term presence in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, which we've never had before. But I would think at that point it would be peaceful, certainly, hopefully.
Tunis, Tunisia, you're on C-SPAN.
Yes, I would like to ask you a question, please. What will happen to the troops of all the Arab countries who's going to be in the underground, to defend Saudi Arabia against Iraq? What will happen to them, because they're the ones going to be on the ground.
Right. There's, I think the Bush administration hopes that Egypt will join this force. They hope to make it multinational and to include Arab forces. There was some suggestion earlier that Moroccan forces may join the force, although I haven't seen any indication of that today. At this point, there are British forces joining the defense of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi forces, and the American forces. At sea, there are French, British, and American. The Soviets may get involved in the naval operations on an ad hoc basis. So it will be multinational, but I think we'll know a lot more after this summit in Cairo that starts later on today, where the Arab world is coming together at the request of the Egyptian president. And I think from that we'll be able to tell how much of an Arab component there is in this force in Saudi Arabia.
Jacksonville, Florida, you're next.
Yes, Mr. Powell, I wanted to inquire as to if you felt that this is purely a temporary solution to Mr. Hussein, as a dictator, it shows that he has had a pattern of behavior in invading anyone. His objectives, as everyone has understood, is that he wants to control the oil and bring the Arab countries together as a force also against Israel. I wanted to ask you if you felt that this might be just a temporary solution to the problem when it comes the time for us to withdraw our troops, whether he attacks Saudi Arabia now or potentially a year from now or 3 years from now. His objectives are going to remain the same.
I think the United States at this point has responded to what appears to be his first objective, which was to seize Kuwait and to threaten Saudi Arabia. The second objective that he may or may not have, which is to dominate the Arab world, I think will be far more difficult to achieve. Two things have happened. One is the United States has now become involved in the Persian Gulf far more deeply than it ever has before, and from my point of view, probably on a more of a permanent basis than it ever has before. And secondly, the Arab world has split over this issue, over the invasion of Kuwait. We'll know again a lot more after this summit in Cairo, but I think Saddam Hussein's ambitions to lead the Arab world have been spoiled essentially by his move into Kuwait.
Stuart Powell has a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University and hails from Chappaqua, New York. Let's take a call now from Santa Monica, California.
Yes, I'd like to ask the expert what we do in the future if we wait for Saddam Hussein to establish a nuclear threat. If he just pulls back now and develops a future nuclear capability and threatens New York or Los Angeles instead of Saudi Arabia, what is his opinion? Should we do anything now about this, or should we just wait and let it happen?
Well, I think the United States has helped lead an international effort to prevent Saddam Hussein from obtaining the triggering devices and the uranium and so on that he would need to produce nuclear weapons. At this point, Iraq is really quite an isolated country, and I don't think the risks of him obtaining the material that he needs to produce nuclear weapons at this point is all that great. Secondly, if he were to obtain nuclear weapons down the road, in order to threaten the United States, he would need to have missiles and other weapons that would reach the United States. And at this point, he doesn't have those things. So I realize there is a fear that Saddam Hussein could obtain nuclear weapons and threaten certainly his neighboring countries. But I don't think with the isolation that he's suffering right now, it's that great a risk.
Savannah, Georgia, good morning.
Yes, Mr. Powell, I have actually a two-part question. Your opinion on the first question, please. There were rumblings coming out of Saudi Arabia 2 weeks prior to the invasion that there was indeed a coup in Kuwait, not a pro-Iranian fundamentalist coup, and that the Iraqis were indeed invited in to stabilize the country. My second, I'd like your opinion on this, the disturbing duality in American policy in the Middle East. The Israelis can occupy and annex de jure territories of 4 countries, and there are absolutely no sanctions. I'd like your opinion on both these questions. I'll hang up and listen for your answers. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know, frankly, whether there was a coup in Kuwait 2 weeks prior to the outbreak of these developments. Saddam Hussein contends that he came in at the request of a Kuwaiti faction and helped install them and helped oust the royal family that's been in that country for some time. I know the Bush administration doesn't believe that and has been acting accordingly. They think that's just a sham. They think the regime that's now set up in Kuwait is a sham, and one of the requirements for one of their Bush administration objectives is that that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait and that sham government be removed. Secondly, on the duality of the United States response to what Israel does in the Middle East as opposed to what Saddam Hussein does in the Middle East, the United States has far deeper and more historic ties with Israel. We have a lot of people in this country who are Jewish and support Israel, and the United States has long had a strategic relationship with Israel involving U.S. Weapons sales, involving pre-positioning of U.S. military equipment, cooperation in securing U.S. interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, helping Israel extract itself from Lebanon. So our relationship with Israel is a whole lot different than our relationship with Iraq.
Do you have a sense of what Israel's role is in helping the U.S. to draw the line in Saudi Arabia?
I think at this point the Bush administration is not raising public attention on what its relationship is with Israel for obvious reasons. It can't obtain Saudi cooperation in this venture if it's seen in the Arab world to be a U.S.-Israeli operation. At this point, it's a U.S. effort to support a long-standing Arab ally. If Iraq goes to war with its neighbors, I'm sure Israel will be there with the United States and with any other countries that have joined in this effort. But at this point, I think the United States has relationships with Israel, it has relationships with Saudi Arabia, and at this point, its dealings with Saudi Arabia are only on a bilateral basis.
Hill Valley, California. Go ahead, please.
Mine is simply a comment. We have absolutely no business in this mess, as usual. Again, we have the Pentagon taking the taxpayers' money and the lives of our sons to protect the interests of the wealthy. Like Audrey 2 in the Little Shop of Horrors, the Pentagon keeps simply stuffing itself. What a monster we have created. We need to get out of this and stay out of this and concentrate on the problems at home. There are alternatives to oil, and we need to use those. We need to get off the oil slick. And this is madness, and we need to stop.
I'm sure there are many people who would agree, particularly with your last point, that the United States needs to shift to other sources of energy. We are in a situation, however, now where the United States relies on oil and the economy relies on oil, and so do the economies of Western Europe and Japan, which are our main trading partners. And if the access to oil were to stop, the United States economy and the way of life that you and I enjoy a great deal would stop as well.
Pat Chogue, New York. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to know who gives the United States the right to govern any other country. When England tried to do that to us in 1774, what did we do? When Israel attacked the Arabs in 67, did we go in to fight the Israelis? What are we going to have? Another Vietnam, have crippled boys and men after all these years? Another question.
Well,
when Israeli attacked Arabs, they did the same thing that Hitler did. The Arabs were paying attention to the United Nations men boarding their patrol. Israeli didn't took that time to build up the armed forces so they'd have the means to attack Arab. What did we United States do? I am sick and tired of the American taxpayer paying and supporting the Israelis for 44 years.
Thanks for the call, ma'am.
Well, I understand your point of view, and I think there are people that agree with you. Again, the United States has a unique relationship with Israel in that part of the world. It has had a historical relationship, and I think it will continue to have a historical relationship. The question is, what do we do in the Arab world now? And for the first time in the Persian Gulf, the United States has what appears to me to be a unique opportunity and a posture in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, that it's never had before. It's going to have land forces on the Arabian Peninsula for the first time, and from my perspective, it looks like it's going to be for a long time. And I think that is going to change the way the United States deals with the Arab world, and hopefully it will be for positive ends.
Detroit, Michigan, you're next.
Yes, we have the largest Arab population outside of the Middle East here in the Detroit, Metro Detroit area. Do you think that that if the worst happens, that we could have the unfortunate incident of backlashes against Arab Americans?
I certainly hope not. There have been instances in the past. I recall reading that, and as World War I started, there was a backlash against German Americans. In World War II, as you probably recall, the Roosevelt administration took Japanese Americans and put them in concentration camps, for want of a better word. And but I think the United States, in this case, it's not going to be an all-out conflict. And I think the objectives in the conflict will be very clear when and if such activity develops. And I would certainly hope that there is no kind of retaliation against people of Arab extraction or any other ethnic or national group.
Reno, Nevada.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, how far away is Iraq from having nuclear weapons?
There's a suspicion in the American intelligence community that Iraq has been moving toward acquiring nuclear weapons. As you probably recall, in the last year or so, there was an effort to prevent Iraq from obtaining the triggering devices that were required to spark nuclear weapons. To me, that suggests that they're quite far along and that they're trying to obtain one of the last elements that they would need to turn the capability into a weapon. Frankly, I don't know how close they are. The Israelis thought they were quite close some time ago when they bombed the Iraqi nuclear facility, nuclear plant, power plant ostensibly. But I don't think we face a nuclear threat, and our forces face a nuclear threat in the Persian Gulf at this time. We face, from my point of view, two major threats. Saddam Hussein has got far more forces, far more close to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula than we do. And secondly, he has chemical weapons, which he has used in the past. And I think those are two very serious threats that we have to face.
Oklahoma City, you're on C-SPAN.
Yes, thank you. It seems that our biggest threat against Iraq seems to be strategic bombing. I was wondering what the Americans' response would be if Hussein were to place hostages in the primary places that we would bomb. What would be our response?
The United States has a capability, obviously, to bomb any installation it wants to in Iraq, either with B-52s, which are in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, with FB-111 intermediate-range bombers, such as the ones that were used in the raid on Libya some time ago. It also has Tomahawk cruise missiles on ships, which are going into the eastern Mediterranean and are already in the Persian Gulf. Those missiles carry a somewhat smaller warhead than most bombs, but they can go about 1,400 miles. So it enables the United States to strike anywhere in Iraq that it chooses to do so. The question, I think, is, are we going to risk the lives of Americans who are in Iraq and who are in Kuwait if it comes to that? And frankly, my impression here in Washington is that the administration is reluctant to, at this point, put those Americans at risk. But if it comes to a situation where the United States economy and way of life is at risk and is in jeopardy by what Saddam Hussein is doing, and if he is starting to move on Saudi Arabia, the United States, from my perspective, will likely go against targets in Iraq, and it will have to accept, unfortunately, the risk to the Americans who are unfortunately stuck in Kuwait and stuck in Baghdad.
What's it like to cover the Pentagon during a crisis like this?
Well, I find myself yesterday, it was scampering around the building, talking to as many different people as you can. In a situation like this, there's a little bit of information in a lot of different places, and you can't get the whole story at one spot. Yesterday, the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed reporters, gave us some insight into what was going on, but often in cases like this where it's unfolding so fast and decisions are still being made, you get a glint of what's going on in other parts of the building and in other parts of the administration. So you add it all up and try to come to the best conclusion you can as quickly as you can.
Fort Worth, Texas. Go ahead, please.
My question exactly to Mr. Powell, as he mentioned a while ago, why don't they go in there and just attack him like they did Gaddafi? They stopped him, and they haven't heard a thing from him for the last 2 to 3 years. Cut the head off the snake, and the body will die along with it.
I think if there was an easy way to strike Saddam Hussein at this point with impunity, it might be a serious option. But I don't think it is being considered, because Saddam Hussein has, as I said, 1 million armed forces. He has 5,500 tanks, more than 500 sophisticated combat aircraft. He's got chemical weapons, he's got artillery, he's got a huge army. It's one of the, I think it's the 4th biggest army in the world, and it's probably one of the largest armies in the 3rd world. So it's not something you would do lightly. If we were to try to do that, take out Saddam Hussein, as it were, we would be taking on a very powerful country in a very volatile part of the world, a long way from where our forces are located today.
San Leandro, California. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Powell. Making a comment about your comment on the nuclear weapons capability of Iraq. It would seem to me that finding the fuel and bringing it to critical mass is fairly easy in design, but they are at the crux, which is igniting it at the critical point, so that they are fairly far away from a nuclear weapon. My question to you is that, or how do you feel about the utilization of air power to stop tanks in the worst case scenario if they come south across the border? My last trip to Dhahran, that particular piece of terrain looked to be excellent for tank warfare, and the use of air would be good, but not stop. It wouldn't stop them.
Right. It would be. I think the first struggle would be for control of the air. If Saddam Hussein sent his tanks south from Kuwait, and I think there are roughly 700 tanks now in Kuwait, if he were to send those across the border, he would obviously send those across with air cover. So the first struggle would be to control the air. That's why the F-15s were sent to Dhahran yesterday rather than F-16s. The F-15 is equipped for air-to-air combat. The F-16 can be equipped for air-to-ground combat. So the first step, I think, is to control the air over the tanks. Secondly, the United States would then launch F-16s, and Saudis, of course, have good combat attack planes against those columns of tanks. And, you know, it's the desert. It's wide open. There's nowhere to hide. If they want to move south into the oil fields, they're going to be exposed to air power. But I think if they were to do it very quickly and before we are in position, it could be a very, very dicey situation.
We have a call from Pakistan, Lahore, Pakistan. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm calling from Pakistan, which is a Muslim country. And it seems to me, I mean, this is correct that Iran and Iraq, which are two Muslim countries, fought against each other in the past few years. But it seems to me that this whole thing of U.S. intervention in, this affair is the old imperialist trick of making Muslims fight each other, divide and rule. And I know several Afghans here in Pakistan and several other Muslims. They pretty much think the same way, that it's the vested interest of the imperialist world which they are trying to protect, and which shows in their contradictory policies when it concerns South Africa or Israel. They never were able to put an embargo against those countries, but where there is a will, there's a way, and there's a will here to protect their interests.
Right. I think we all would hope that people who believe in our religion wouldn't fight each other. I think there's a dream of Arab or Muslim solidarity, which is a fiction. The Arab world is divided just as is the Christian world. There have been wars crisscrossing Europe for centuries, and it's predominantly a Christian region, and so religion is no assurance that countries won't go to war. Secondly, the United States has vital interests in this area. The future of this country's economy and the economy of our allies around the world is at stake here, from my point of view. And if oil is totally controlled by Saddam Hussein, there is a risk that he could control the future of this country's economic security. And that is an issue that is so important that I think the Bush administration is willing to take the risks that it's undertaken.
Evansville, Indiana, you're next.
Yes, I'm a student of Saddam Hussein, and I have a little bit different view of what's going on over there. I believe that the oil is merely a means to an end. In 22 of 24 speeches Hussein made in the first half of 1990, he spoke about the Saudis not being worthy custodians of El Medina and Mecca. He went to war principally against the Ayatollah Khomeini because he didn't want a non-Arab Mahdi. And millions, perhaps tens of millions of people think of Saddam Hussein as the Mahdi. And, of course, now he could still strike through Jordan and down the Red Sea coast and take what I believe are his true objectives. Maybe this thing with the oil will pass and we will leave, but eventually, in order to maintain the image that he has of himself as not the leader of the Arab world, but the leader of the Muslim world, he must eventually go after at least part of Saudi Arabia. I'd like your opinion, please.
I'm not convinced that his ultimate goal is to protect and control the sacred Muslim cities in Saudi Arabia. I think his objective is oil and his objective is power in the region and to become the main force to be reckoned with in that region. And I don't think he could muster much support in his own country to take on a holy war, as it were, against the Saudis in order to control Mecca and Medina.
North Hollywood, California. Go ahead, please.
Okay. When it comes down to goals and such, why do we assume that his goals are necessarily in the direction of economics and oil? And considering that he can put, what is it, approximately 1,800,000 men in the field that are blooded troops, which are certainly enough to penetrate all the way to Mecca and Medina, and then control those cities and call jihad from Mecca and Medina, that he could control the entire Mideast and call those that believe those as holy cities, that he is indeed the Mahdi, and declare holy war for anybody he chooses that's on any of those borders.
I think that the way in which he's operating does not generate support in the Arab world or in the Muslim world. And I think as you see this issue work its way through the United Nations, there will not be Arab solidarity or Muslim solidarity on Saddam Hussein's efforts to occupy Kuwait, much less take on Saudi Arabia in order to take control of those two cities.
What countries are participating in the Arab summit that is to occur today?
The big question is, will Saddam Hussein show up? The indications this morning are that he won't. At this point, it's the major Arab countries meeting at Hosni Mubarak's request in Egypt. But I think the die is cast in Saudi Arabia. There is going to be a multinational force. The real question is, will it have an Arab component? And the Bush administration, I think, expects it to have an Arab component, and that will be decided, I think, by the decisions taken in Cairo.
Chester, Connecticut. You're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to ask, who contributed the armament for the Iraqi government? And as well, how long do we, as a nation, expect to be the police force for the world, generally speaking?
Well, the Iraqi arms come principally from the Soviet Union and secondly from France. The role of the United States as a policeman in the world is one way to portray United States actions in this case, but I think perhaps a more fairer way to portray the United States actions in this case is the United States is a world power. It relies on oil. The oil that fuels this economy and the economy of the Western world is potentially at risk here, and the United States is protecting its vital interests in this part of the world, as have countries in other times protected their vital interests at other locations. So I think the United States is acting in a way that is understandable in a historical context, and I think the results hopefully will be peaceful rather than conflict.
Louisville, Kentucky. Good morning.
Good morning. Let me just say, at the outset, I'm an ex-Air Force intelligence officer and also have a degree in international relations. I just want to make a couple minor points and one major one. The F-16 was primarily an air-to-air interceptor, also been modified for ground attack, so neither of those aircraft are true ground attack aircraft. The problem with chemical warfare is that the problem is not whether you have good protective suits or not, but the point is if you're forced to operate in that restrictive environment and the other people aren't, then that gives them the tactical advantage, which means that you almost have to have the will to use offensive chemical weapons to then, in effect, make them operate in the same environment that you're operating in. Right. Otherwise, you operate at a terrible disadvantage. The other thing that I've surprised no newspaper commentator has made a point about is the fact that this also points out our deficiency in heavy airlift, and of course the C-17 was just axed from the budget, which was supposed to alleviate that deficiency. And that dovetails right into the fact that obviously it doesn't do any good to get fighter aircraft over there if you can't bring all the associated support equipment and extra ammunition, etc. And then I also might want to make one thing about the nuclear aspect, which a couple callers commented on, which I thought was to the point is if Hussein does nothing or retreats and then later, several years down the road, develops a nuclear capability and ballistic capability with greater range, the ultimate objective is that just the parallel would be if this was Hitler that went into Czechoslovakia and then retreated, and 15 years later down the road he has the atomic bomb. So the point is that the ultimate question, which nobody seems willing to face politically, is the fact that ultimately you just got to go in and, in effect, take him out, because you're just going to buy even, time is no respecter of good or evil intentions. Both things happen over time. And so, many people say it's wise to wait and see. Sometimes Genghis Khan returns with the telegraph, as it were. So then one other point I would make is that also as far as the ballistic problem, which many people think then the thin shield or SDI would handle that problem. So there's another political debate which people can talk about. But I would only point out that cruise missile technology is much, much simpler. And basically, there's nothing to stop any nation from putting a cruise missile on a tramp steamer and sailing it into the port of New York or 50 miles off of New York or whatever, and threatening us that way. And so that's a problem that I don't think many people are very cognizant of.
Thank you, Kentucky.
Well, I think the question that obviously circulates in this town is when Saddam Hussein will get nuclear capability. If he does, what capacity does he have to deliver it against U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia now, much less against the port of New York or wherever. There are no indications, from what I can tell, that the administration thinks he has the capability. And I think the international blockade and the location of American forces in Saudi Arabia may serve as a deterrent to him moving in that direction, and certainly to other countries supplying him the material and expertise that he might need to complete that program. Secondly, the heavy airlift, we are again at an advantage in Saudi Arabia because we have had bases and cooperative agreements with Saudi Arabia. We've helped them build a lot of these facilities, and so we are going into a situation where we do have some infrastructure, we do have some logistical support in place. A lot of the aircraft that the Saudis have are compatible with our aircraft, so a lot of the equipment and so on can be interchanged if necessary. So again, the lack of heavy airlift is, of course, a risk to the United States, and perhaps we need more. I think there are a lot of people who would agree with you. But again, in Saudi Arabia, we have a little bit of an advantage that we might not have in another part of the world. The question of offensive chemical weapons capability, I've been told, or it's been indicated to me, that the United States forces going into the Persian Gulf and into Saudi Arabia, at a minimum, have ready access to chemical weapons to serve as a deterrent against Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons against American forces. U.S. policy allows the United States to use chemical weapons against a country or a force that uses such weapons against us. And by having them available to U.S. forces in the region, presumably we will assure that if they attack us, they too will face the risk, and therefore they will have to operate in those cumbersome suits, and their capabilities will be deteriorated every bit as much as ours have been in that situation. And finally, you're absolutely right about the F-16. It was designed as an air-to-air. It's now being equipped with Maverick missiles and other air-to-ground weapons to attack tanks if necessary, and I think that will be the chief aircraft that we rely on based in Saudi Arabia, plus attack aircraft based on the aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and in the Red Sea.
Has the Pentagon or the White House issued any statement as to whether our troops would use chemical weapons offensively?
The question was asked yesterday at the Pentagon, and General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, indicated that the United States forces would have the capability to defend themselves against a chemical attack. By that, I was told he meant not only have the correct protective gear, but also have access to the chemical weapons deterrent that would be necessary to deter that kind of attack. And the President, I think, made it very clear in his remarks yesterday that the United States would take very, very seriously any use of these weapons, and I think it would bring really a wholesale attack on facilities in Iraq.
Seattle, Washington, good morning.
Good morning. I just have a clarification for my own mind, basically. I keep hearing and have been hearing throughout this whole deal about the sanctions and the sanctions that aren't on Israel that we are putting on Iraq. My basic question is, did not the Israeli-occupied territories come about after the 67 Yom Kippur War when they were attacked and they had to defend themselves and became out the victor in that war? This was not an aggression on Israel's part. It did not start out as an aggression on Israel's part. occupied territories were occupied as a result of a war that was perpetrated against them. Isn't that the way that it went? I mean, they did not go out and aggressively seek this territory. And I think there's a big difference between Iraq going out and aggressively seeking another country to occupy and Israel fighting back at someone that was trying to occupy their land and therefore occupying the land. I'm not saying that I approve of the West Bank settlements or anything like that, but I think that historically, and I have not heard anyone put it into historical context, that in protecting yourself, it's a little bit different than going out in order to acquire new properties.
Well, you're right. The Israelis occupied the West Bank after the '67 war. They've occupied other territories in other wars, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and so on. There are obviously a large group of people who feel that Israel is fighting for its national survival in that part of the world, and there are other people who feel that the Israelis have, in the name of national security, have taken advantage of the situation out there. It's obviously a very volatile issue and a very heatedly debated issue, and you can argue it either way.
We have time for one last quick call from Easton, Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Powell, I was wondering if Hussein did take his million troops into the Saudi Arabian borders, would he be worried about Iran attacking Iraq because they have no troops left in Iraq?
I think that's a possibility. It may constrain him from moving a large number of forces south through Kuwait and into Saudi Arabia if he chooses to attack Saudi Arabia. But frankly, at this point, I don't think Iran is much of a threat to him. It's essentially prostrate economically and militarily from losing the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam Hussein essentially won the Iran-Iraq war. And secondly, Iran is consumed right now with rebuilding from that devastating earthquake. And so I don't think it's in any position to really do anything.
You mentioned that the next 72 hours will be critical. What can we expect in the next 3 days?
Well, you can expect the United States to continue to ferry troops and equipment into the region. That will continue around the clock from bases around this country and probably from installations in Europe once the United States meets with its NATO allies tomorrow in Brussels. Secondly, the thing to watch from my point of view is what Saddam Hussein does in Kuwait. Does he start moving and posturing his forces in Kuwait, or does he stand still and show every indication of not operating against Saudi Arabia? So you're going to have a U.S. buildup, and we're going to have to see just how hard-pressed Saddam Hussein is and whether he's going to take action at this window of opportunity from his point of view.
Well, Stuart Powell of Hearst Newspapers, we thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you to our callers, and have a good day.
That concludes this program focusing on the deployment of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. We invite you to join us tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock Eastern Time for this week's edition of Journalist Roundtable. 3 journalists will join us for this live call-in program to offer their analysis of events in the news this week. Stay with us now for a speech by Congressman William Gray III.